There is a line under the sand that should not exist, and the man who found it almost lost everything trying to tell people about it. David was not an explorer. He was not an adventurer. He was a surveyor with a coffee-stained desk, a second-hand monitor, and a job that mostly involved staring at mineral density readouts until his eyes went dry. Routine work. The kind of work where nothing surprising ever happens. That changed on a Tuesday afternoon when he was processing a standard scan of a remote desert interior region, the kind of place that does not appear on tourist maps and does not need to. He was looking for trace mineral deposits. What he found instead was a line, not a crack, not a fault, a line, perfectly straight, running across the scan data for roughly 30 miles before it disappeared at the edge of the survey boundary. He leaned closer to the monitor. The light in his office was bad, the kind of pale yellow that makes everything look slightly wrong, and for a moment, he genuinely thought the sensor had malfunctioned. He flagged it as an error in his notes. He moved on. He went home that evening, ate dinner, watched something forgettable on television, and did not think about the line again. But the line was patient. 3 months later, a separate field team working a completely different region, hundreds of miles from David's scan area, submitted their own readout to the central database. David was reviewing incoming files when he opened it and felt something cold move through his chest. There it was again, the same signature, a straight line cutting through the terrain data at the same depth, the same width, the same orientation, parallel to his original finding, same spacing, same everything. He pulled up both files side by side and sat there for a long time without moving. The office around him hummed with the ordinary sounds of an ordinary afternoon. Someone 2 desks over was on a phone call about a lunch order. Outside, a delivery truck reversed with that familiar beeping sound. Everything was completely normal, and on his screen, something was completely not. He called his supervisor. His supervisor looked at the data for about 40 seconds and said it was probably a calibration error across both units, a known issue with that model of sensor in high-heat environments. He recommended David log it and move on. David logged it. He did not move on. That night, he went back through the database looking for any other scans from the interior region that might overlap with his original survey area. He found 4. He almost missed the relevant detail in the third one because it was buried in the raw data rather than the processed output. The kind of thing that only shows up if you are specifically looking for it and know what format to look in. Another line. Same depth. Running perpendicular this time, intersecting the first at what his measurement tool confirmed was a 90-degree angle. He sat back in his chair, and the chair creaked under him, and the sound was very loud in the quiet of his apartment. He thought about the word calibration error. He thought about how a calibration error would have to be extraordinarily specific and extraordinarily consistent to produce 3 separate 90-degree intersecting lines across 3 separate surveys conducted by 3 separate teams, using 3 separate units in 3 separate months. And then he thought about what, other than a sensor error, could possibly produce that pattern in the ground. He did not sleep that night. He sat at his desk with a cold cup of coffee going warm and then cold again, and he pulled every available aerial and orbital dataset for the broader region that he could access with his credentials. By 4 in the morning, he had stopped looking for more lines. There were too many of them. The question had changed. It was no longer what is this? It was now how long has this been here? And why has nobody said anything? If this kind of research pulls at something in you the way it pulled at David, subscribe and leave a like. It genuinely helps this channel keep going deeper on stories like this one. Because here's the thing about David's discovery. It did not come out of nowhere. The reason nobody had flagged those lines before, the reason they had been sitting in archived scan data for years without anyone raising an alarm, comes down to a story that is much older than David, much older than modern survey equipment, and much more deliberately constructed than most people realize. The official version of what that desert interior is, and what it has always been, is one of the cleanest and most confidently told stories in all of recorded history. Clean in the way that a room looks clean when someone has just shoved everything into the closet before guests arrive. The story goes like this. The interior was once green, rain, rivers, animals, people. Then the climate shifted, and the water left, and the people followed the water toward the great rivers at the edges. What remained was nothing. Sand, heat, wind, and silence. No cities, no roads, no reason to build anything. Just a vast interior that served, at best, as an obstacle between the places that actually mattered. That story has been told so many times, in so many textbooks, in so many documentaries with sweeping aerial shots of dunes set to dramatic music, that it stopped being a theory a long time ago. It became a fact, the kind of fact that nobody checks anymore because it has been checked enough times by enough serious people, and the answer always comes back the same. Empty. Always was. Always will be. And the thing is, parts of that story are true. The climate did shift. The vegetation did retreat. People did move toward the rivers. Nobody serious disputes that. But a story can be mostly true and still be missing something enormous. A story can be built on solid ground and still have a door in it that nobody has opened in a very long time. What David found in those scan files was not a refutation of the official story. It was a door. A door in the shape of a 90-degree angle, running 30 miles through the rock and soil of a place that was supposed to contain nothing worth finding. And once he saw it, he could not stop seeing it. The data that had been sitting in archives for years suddenly looked completely different. Not because the data had changed, because the question had. The official story had always assumed the interior was empty, so every anomaly in every survey got explained in terms that preserved that assumption. Calibration errors, natural formations, weathering patterns. The explanations were not dishonest. They were just automatic. Nobody was lying. They were just answering a question that was shaped by a story they had always believed. And when the story is wrong, the answers it produces are wrong too, even when the data underneath is pointing somewhere else entirely. David had spent his career answering questions shaped by that story. And now, at 4 in the morning with a cold cup of coffee and a screen full of perfectly parallel lines, he was standing at the edge of a completely different question, one that the official story had no good answer for. David sent the data to Sarah on a Thursday morning with no subject line and no explanation. Just the files. She called him back in less than 2 days, and the first thing she said was not hello. She said, "Where did you get this?" Not a question, a demand. The kind of voice people use when they already know the answer is going to be complicated and they are bracing for it. Sarah was a geomorphologist, which means she spent her career studying how terrain forms, how water and wind and time shape the surface of the earth. She knew what natural processes look like at every scale, from a handful of eroded gravel to a mountain range carved by glaciers over millions of years. She knew the signatures, she knew the patterns, and she knew, the moment she opened David's files, that what she was looking at did not have a natural signature. David explained the scans, the 3 separate surveys, the parallel lines, the 90-degree intersection. Sarah was quiet for a long time after he finished. He could hear her breathing and the faint sound of papers moving, the way people shuffle things around when their hands need something to do while their brain works through something difficult. Then she said it, clean and simple and with no drama. Natural erosion does not make right angles. That sentence sat between them on the phone like a stone dropped into still water. David had already known it, somewhere in the part of his mind that had kept him awake until 4 in the morning. But hearing it said out loud by someone with Sarah's credentials made it real in a different way. It crossed a line from a private suspicion into something that now existed between 2 people, something that could not be easily unsaid. They stayed on the call for another hour. David walked her through every data set he had pulled. Sarah kept stopping him to ask about specific measurements, specific depths, specific angles. She was checking his work the way a careful person checks something they desperately want to find an error in. She did not find one. By the end of the call, she had gone quiet in a different way. Not thinking quiet, but the kind of quiet that comes after you have run out of alternative explanations, and the one remaining explanation is sitting right there in front of you. What they had found when they laid all the data out together was not just a few straight lines. It was a grid. A massive, deliberate, organized grid of formations running under the surface of a desert interior that was supposed to contain nothing. Hub points where multiple lines converged. Dry basin areas that sat at the center of spoke formations radiating outward in regular intervals. Elevated platforms at consistent spacing that from ground level would look like nothing at all, but from altitude formed a pattern so regular it looked engineered, because it was engineered. There was no other word for it. The problem was scale. The thing was enormous. Not city-sized enormous, not even region-sized enormous. The grid, as best as David and Sarah could map it from the available data, covered an area that made both of them go very still when they finally put a rough boundary around it. It was the size of something that should have a name, something that should be in every textbook ever printed, and it had no name. It had no entry in any database. It had no research designation, no excavation history, no footnote in any paper either of them could find. It was just there, under the sand, invisible from the ground, apparently unnoticed for as long as anyone had been looking. Or, and this was the thought that started keeping David awake again, not unnoticed, just unexplained, explained away, filed under calibration error and moved past. The question of which one it was, genuine oversight or something more deliberate, was a question David was not yet ready to answer, but it was already forming. It had already taken root. He had no idea yet that someone had already tried to answer it decades before him, and that the answer had cost that person everything. The man's name was Ray, and by the time David found out about him, Ray had been retired for years. The story reached David not through any official channel, but through a geology forum, the kind of low-traffic online community where older professionals sometimes post things they can no longer say in any professional context. Someone had written a short post about a field geologist who had worked a survey near a dry escarpment in the same general interior region decades earlier. The post was vague, the way posts are when someone is being careful, but the details that were there were specific enough to stop David mid-scroll. Ray had found a structure, not lines on a scan, an actual physical structure. Stone blocks, fitted together without mortar, arranged in a rectangle that was too regular and too deliberate to be natural. He was not looking for it. He literally walked into it during a routine ground survey, the kind of work where you are watching your footing and checking your equipment and not expecting the desert floor to suddenly become a wall. He took samples. That was the thing Ray did that changed everything. He had the presence of mind, in the heat and the dust and the disorientation of standing in front of something that should not exist, to take core samples from the organic material trapped between the stones and send them to a university lab for dating. He packed them carefully, labeled them correctly, shipped them through the standard process, and then waited. The results came back and Ray read them 3 times. Then he called the lab and asked them to run the test again. They did. The number did not change. The organic material between those stones was old. Not ancient civilization old. Not even early human old. Older than that. Old enough that the number itself was a problem, because it placed the construction of that structure at a point in time when, according to everything the academic world had agreed upon, nobody anywhere was building anything out of fitted stone. Ray wrote it up. He submitted it. He was reassigned within a season. The structure was quietly reclassified in the survey records as a natural formation. The lab results were not published. And when David searched every current academic database he could access for any reference to that site, that escarpment, those sample results, he found nothing. Not a disputed paper, not a retraction, nothing, the kind of nothing that does not happen by accident. David found the image on a Tuesday evening and did not move from his chair for 40 minutes. He had been working through older orbital survey archives, the kind of data that gets uploaded once and then sits untouched because nobody has a specific reason to look at it. He was searching for any terrain signature that matched the grid formations he and Sarah had already mapped, trying to extend the boundary of what they knew. And then the image loaded on his screen, and he just stopped. Everything stopped. It was a circular formation, enormous, so large that when he first opened the file he thought he was looking at a geological region map rather than a single feature. 3 distinct rings, one inside the other, like the cross-section of a very old tree. The interior plane was flat in a way that flat terrain rarely is, the kind of flat that suggests it was worked rather than formed. And radiating outward from the outer ring, visible as faint dry channels in the surrounding terrain, were what looked unmistakably like drainage paths, the kind of paths water leaves when it moves fast and in enormous quantity. David had seen drainage formations before. They fan outward randomly, following the path of least resistance, branching the way tree roots branch, organic and irregular. These were not like that. These channels radiated at consistent intervals, like the spokes of a wheel, and they all pointed in the same general direction, toward a dry coastal plain to the west. The kind of direction water moves when something forces it to move all at once. He sat there in his apartment with the screen casting pale light across his face and the sound of the street outside doing its ordinary evening things, And he felt something he had not expected to feel. Not excitement, something closer to vertigo. The formation was so large, so geometrically distinct, so plainly visible in the data, that the only honest question was why it had not been the center of a major research effort for decades. He started searching, and he found out very quickly that he was not the first person to look at this formation and feel that vertigo. A small number of researchers, spread across different fields and different decades, had each independently noticed the same thing: the circular rings, the flat interior, the drainage channels pointing west. Each of them had written something about it. Each of them had pointed out that the hydrology around the formation showed clear evidence of a catastrophic water event, a sudden inundation followed by rapid drying, the kind of geological signature that does not come from gradual climate change, but from something much faster. And each of them had been met with the same response: not refutation, not engagement, just a kind of institutional shrug, a collective turning away, a polite suggestion that they were drawing conclusions that the evidence did not support. The formation was natural. The drainage was erosion. There was nothing there worth investigating further. Move along. David printed out everything he could find written about the site. He spread the pages across his kitchen table and stood over them with a coffee going cold in his hand. What struck him was not just the similarity of the observations across different researchers in different eras. It was the similarity of the dismissals. The language used to close down each inquiry was almost identical, as if the same template had been applied each time, as if someone, somewhere, had decided very firmly that this particular formation was not going to become a subject of serious study and had made sure the door stayed closed every time someone reached for it. He did not know yet what had actually happened at that site. He did not know what the water event was, or when it occurred, or what it had swept away. But he knew that the formation was real, that the hydrology was real, and that the pattern of suppressed inquiry around it was real. And he knew that whatever was at the center of those three rings, it was connected to the grid he and Sarah had been mapping. The drainage channels pointed west toward the coast. The grid infrastructure pointed east toward the interior. They were two ends of the same system, and the system was far larger than either of them had imagined. What David did not know yet was that someone had already mapped a significant piece of that system, decades earlier, from a completely different direction, and that person was a historian named Lisa who had never heard of David, had never seen his scan data, and had arrived at almost exactly the same conclusion by digging through boxes of handwritten expedition records in a storage facility that smelled of old paper and dry rot. Lisa was not looking for a lost civilization when she started. She was looking for something much more specific. She was trying to trace the administrative records of a particular ancient people, a culture that the historical sources described as a minor desert kingdom, capable enough to resist outside conquest but too small and too remote to matter much in the broader story of the ancient world. That was the standard description. That was what every source said. And Lisa, who had spent enough years with primary sources to know when a standard description was doing a lot of heavy lifting, had started to suspect that this one was doing more than most. The expedition records she was working through were colonial-era documents, the kind that get digitized last because nobody expects them to contain anything surprising. Handwritten field notes, rough sketches, supply inventories, occasional observations about terrain. She was reading through them slowly, making her own notes, when she found a sketch that made her set down her pen. It was a map, rough, drawn in the field with whatever instrument the surveyor had available, covering a region that corresponded to a dry interior basin she recognized from David's grid data, though she did not know David yet and had never seen his data. The surveyor had drawn lines. Lots of them, running under the terrain, marked with small notations about depth and direction and what appeared to be flow capacity. Underground channels, dozens of them, spreading out from a central point like the root system of something very large. The surveyor's note at the bottom of the sketch said simply that the local guides had called it the Old Water, and had seemed unsurprised to find it there, as if it were simply a known feature of a landscape that outsiders had never bothered to understand. Lisa turned the page. There was another sketch, and another. The channels kept appearing, survey after survey, region after region, each set of notes filed separately, each surveyor apparently unaware that the others had found the same thing. Nobody had ever put the sketches together in the same room and looked at them as a single picture, until now, And the picture they made, spread across Lisa's work table under the flickering light of a storage facility, was not a minor desert kingdom's irrigation system. It was something that had no name in any history book she had ever read. The ancient world was not built where we think it was built, and the proof was sitting in a spreadsheet on David's screen at 2 in the morning. He and Lisa had been talking every day for 3 weeks by that point. She would send him a scanned page from the expedition records. He would overlay the channel positions onto his terrain grid, and together they would watch the picture grow. It was like assembling something in the dark, finding pieces by feel, and then suddenly the lights come on, and you realize the thing you have been building is much larger than the box it came in. The channel network that Lisa had mapped from the colonial records connected sites that were nowhere near each other, not neighboring regions, not adjacent basins, locations separated by distances that made no practical sense for a local irrigation system. The tunnels ran under terrain that had been dry desert for longer than any recorded civilization had existed. They connected points in the deep interior to points near the old coastlines, to points near what had once been inland seas, to points that sat at the base of mountain ranges, where the rock was a particular dark color that David kept noticing in the survey data and could not immediately explain. Lisa was the one who pushed the materials question. She had found references in the expedition records to local traders describing ancient routes, not caravan routes across the open desert, but specific corridors, fixed paths that the guides treated as known infrastructure, even though there was nothing visible on the surface to mark them. The traders described these corridors as the old metal roads. Lisa had initially assumed this was a metaphor. Then she started cross-referencing the corridor locations with known artifact compositions from ancient Mediterranean cultures, and something very uncomfortable began to emerge. There was a particular alloy composition that showed up in artifacts from multiple ancient cultures spread across a wide geographic area. Weapons, tools, ceremonial objects. The alloy had a very specific trace element signature, a chemical fingerprint that materials scientists had been trying to match to a source deposit for a long time. The known mining regions in the Mediterranean and the Near East did not match. The signature pointed to something different, something from a much deeper interior source. When David overlaid the metal road corridors from Lisa's records onto the terrain grid, the corridors ran directly through the hub points of the grid system. The same infrastructure that carried water also carried materials. The same network that irrigated the interior also moved resources across distances that the official history of the ancient world had never been able to explain. The Mediterranean cultures that history called foundational, the ones that produced the artifacts with the unmatched alloy signature, were at the end of a supply chain. They were recipients. The source was in the interior. The source was connected to the grid. And the grid was very, very old. David sat back and looked at the map they had built together and thought about what it meant. The story of the ancient world had always been told from the edges inward. The rivers, the coasts, the fertile crescents. The interior was always the blank space, the nothing, the place civilization had not reached yet. But if the interior was the source, then the story had been told backward. The edges were not the beginning, they were the delivery points. The beginning was buried under the sand, under the grid, under the channels that Lisa's colonial surveyors had sketched without understanding what they were sketching. That realization sat heavy and very quiet in David's chest. He did not sleep at all that night. It was Lisa who found the geological thread, and she found it in the most unexpected place. She had been going through a batch of expedition records from a coastal survey team, documents that had nothing to do with the interior at all, when she came across a note from a field geologist who had been part of the team. The note was brief, almost an aside, describing an unusual rock layer the geologist had noticed while taking core samples near a dry escarpment at the edge of the interior. He described the layer as fused, glassy, with a surface texture unlike anything he had seen in standard weathering processes. He noted the depth at which it appeared and moved on to the next observation without dwelling on it. Lisa almost missed it. The note was sandwiched between 2 pages of supply inventory and written in a handwriting that was difficult to read in the scan. But something about the description snagged in her mind and she went back to it. Fused. Glassy. She sent the page to David with a single line of her own. "Does this mean anything to you?" David looked at it and felt the cold move through him again. The same cold he had felt the first time Sarah said the words, "Natural erosion does not make right angles," because he had seen that description before, not once, multiple times, scattered through different geology reports from completely different parts of the region, each one describing the same thing in slightly different language. A layer of material at a consistent depth that looked as if the rock had been subjected to extreme heat. Not gradual heat, not volcanic activity. The kind of heat that arrives fast and leaves fast and turns whatever it touches into something that looks like the inside of a kiln. He started pulling every geology report he could access that mentioned the interior region. The layer kept appearing. Different teams, different years, different locations spread across an enormous geographic area, all describing the same fused glassy layer at the same approximate depth in the stratigraphic record. The layer was not localized. It was not the signature of a single event in a single place. It covered an area so large that when David mapped the data points, his hands were not entirely steady. He called Lisa. She picked up immediately. He could hear traffic in the background and the sound of a door closing as she moved somewhere quieter. He told her what he had found. She was silent for a moment, and then she said quietly, "What temperature does rock need to reach to fuse like that?" David had already looked it up. The answer was somewhere around 2,000 degrees, not in one spot, across hundreds of thousands of square miles of terrain. In what the geological record suggested was a very short period of time. Whatever had happened in that interior had not been slow. It had not been a gradual climate shift. Something had hit that region with an intensity that turned the surface to glass. And the timing of that layer in the rock record sat at almost exactly the same point that the interior civilization, the one running the grid and the channels and the metal corridors, stopped showing any sign of activity at all. The grid went silent. The channels stopped carrying water, the corridors went dark, and across the surface of an enormous region, the rock melted. The civilizations we were taught to admire were not the beginning of the story. They were what crawled out of the wreckage. David had been sitting with that thought for days before he finally said it out loud to Lisa. She did not push back. She just said quietly that she had been thinking the same thing but had not wanted to be the first one to say it. That was the moment the investigation shifted. It stopped being about the grid and the channels and the fused rock layer. It became about something harder to look at directly. It became about what survived and what that survival actually looked like. David started pulling construction records, not modern ones, ancient ones, the oldest documented structures from the cultures that history had always placed at the beginning of the human story. The cultures that built in stone and left things behind that still stand. He was looking for something specific. He wanted to see the learning curve. The progression from rough early attempts to refined mastery. Every craft, every technology, every skill set that humans develop follows the same arc. You start clumsy, you improve, you reach a peak. The record should show that arc clearly if those cultures had genuinely invented their own techniques from scratch. It did not show that arc. It showed the opposite. The oldest surviving structures from those cultures were consistently the most precise. Not the largest, not the most decorated, but the most technically exact. The surface tolerances on the oldest stonework were tighter than anything that came after. The internal geometry of the oldest chambers was more accurate than the geometry of chambers built by later dynasties with more resources and more workers. The quality moved in one direction across time, and that direction was downward. Each generation produced work that was slightly less precise than the generation before it. The techniques were not being refined, they were being forgotten. David laid out the data in a simple timeline and stared at it for a long time. What he was looking at was the signature of inheritance, not invention. When you inherit a skill without fully understanding its foundations, you can replicate the surface of it for a while. You can produce something that looks like the original. But the deep knowledge, the part that lives in the hands and the mind of the person who actually developed the method, that part does not transfer cleanly. It degrades with each passing. And after enough generations, the copies are pale shadows of the thing they were copied from. That was what the construction record showed. Pale shadows, getting paler. The thing they had been copied from was somewhere else. It was in the interior. It was under the sand. And it had been running at full capacity right up until the moment the rock turned to glass. Lisa found the confirmation of this from a completely different angle. She had been going back through the older expedition records with a new question in mind, looking not for infrastructure, but for objects, tools, fragments, anything the surveyors had picked up and described. She found references to a particular type of worked stone that kept appearing at interior sites, described by multiple surveyors across multiple expeditions as unlike any stonework they had encountered elsewhere. The descriptions were consistent: smooth surfaces, interlocking forms that required no binding material, edges so clean the surveyors assumed they were looking at machined modern objects until they checked the context of where the pieces had been found. Some of these fragments were sitting in colonial-era collection boxes in storage facilities, cataloged vaguely and never studied in depth. Lisa requested access to 3 of them. She sent photographs to a materials analyst she trusted. The analyst came back with a result that neither of them had fully expected, not because the quality was surprising by that point, but because the tool marks on the stone did not match any known ancient working method. They did not match any modern method either. The analyst said carefully that the surface finish suggested a process he could not identify. That was the sentence that closed the loop. Not a dating result, not a satellite image. A materials analyst saying simply, "I cannot identify the process that made this." The people who had built the grid and run the channels and moved materials across a continent had worked stone in a way that nobody since had managed to replicate. And then the event happened, and then they were gone. And the cultures that came after inherited fragments, stories, shapes, the general memory of what sophisticated construction looked like, and did their best with it. And their best was genuinely impressive. It still is. But it was not the original. By the time David and Lisa published their findings, they had been working together for just over a year. They did not write a grand theory. They were both too careful for that, and they had both watched what happened to researchers who reached too far ahead of their evidence. They published what they could prove. The geometry of the grid was documented and reproducible. The channel network extent was mapped from primary sources. The material trail connecting interior source points to ancient Mediterranean artifact compositions was laid out with full methodology. The fused rock layer was cross-referenced across enough independent geological reports to establish it as a regional phenomenon rather than a local one. The construction quality decline across documented ancient sites was presented as a dataset with no interpretive conclusion attached. They let the data speak and did not tell the reader what to hear. The institutional response was silence. Not the engaged silence of people thinking hard about new evidence. The flat silence of a door being quietly closed. No major journal published a rebuttal. No prominent researcher addressed the material sourcing data or the construction quality timeline. The grid paper got a handful of citations in niche publications and then settled into the same obscure orbit that every uncomfortable finding eventually finds itself in. David had half expected this. Lisa had fully expected it. Neither of them was surprised, but neither of them stopped either, because the desert was not waiting for institutional approval to reveal what it had. The wind kept moving. The dunes kept shifting. Other researchers, independently and in different parts of the world, kept finding pieces of the same picture. A geologist in one region posting about an unusual rock layer that matched David's descriptions. A historian in another country writing about expedition records she had found that matched Lisa's channel maps. Small voices, scattered, not yet connected, but accumulating. The way evidence always accumulates when the thing it points to is real. You cannot suppress a physical object indefinitely. You can ignore it, reclassify it, file it, and forget it, but it does not go away. It sits in the ground, or in the archive, or in the photograph, and it waits. The interior had been waiting for a very long time already. A little longer made no difference. Here's what this whole story comes down to. We are not the first people to figure things out. We are not the peak of what humans have been capable of. We are, in all likelihood, one more chapter in a much longer book, and some of the earlier chapters were more impressive than anything we have managed so far. That is not a comfortable thought. It is much easier to believe that everything moves forward, that each generation knows more than the last, that the arrow of progress only ever points one direction. But the evidence does not support that story. The evidence suggests that something enormous was built, ran for a long time, and then ended. And that what came after, including everything we call ancient history, was the long, slow process of piecing things back together from memory. The question that keeps David awake, and if you have listened this far it should keep you awake too, is this. If a civilization advanced enough to engineer a continental water grid and work stone in ways we still cannot replicate, could disappear so completely that we spent centuries assuming the place it existed was always empty, what does that tell us about how permanent anything we have built actually is? Think about that, and then tell us in the comments what you think was really buried out there because we want to know where your mind goes with this. If this story made you think, leave a like and subscribe. There is a lot more where this came from, and you do not want to miss what comes next.